Turning to one of our top stories now, the 2017 budget tabled in Ottawa this afternoon. Affordable housing was top of mind in federal Finance Minister Bill Morneau's blueprint for spending. Today, $11.2 billion is being earmarked for cities and provinces to develop affordable housing over the next 10 years. And with more reaction to today's budget, we're joined by Kishone Roy with the BC Nonprofit Housing Association. Thanks so much for being with us, Kishone.
Thank you, Samantha.
So your immediate reaction upon hearing that?
Well, I think during the federal election, the biggest issue for British Columbians was a desire to see the federal government come back with a national housing strategy. They've lived up to that commitment today. This is a 10-year program, which I think is really important that there's a long horizon to this because housing takes a long time to build. But the housing crisis is worse in BC than anywhere in the rest of the country. And that's why I think that British Columbians will be following that aspect of the budget more than anything else.
Now, looking at the money that's been earmarked for so-called affordable housing, from my analysis and what I've read so far today, it seems that that money really would only go to maintaining the existing infrastructure that we have, updating it, making sure that it's still livable, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't necessarily mean that more housing will be built, does it?
Well, there's four components to this. One of them does help rehabilitate some of that social housing stock, which is deteriorating. But there is long-term funding here to build new housing. And perhaps even more importantly, the federal government is now committed to create a lending vehicle, which will allow co-ops, nonprofits, and municipalities to be able to access CMHC's preferred lending rate, as well as some other capital to be able to borrow to build even more housing. And finally, I think when I look at the commitment to use some federal lands to be able to build affordable housing on, that could be the most important thing here in BC because land costs are driving the cost of housing up like crazy.
Absolutely. So you seem to be encouraged by what you've heard so far.
Yeah, I'm very optimistic about this. I think we're going to need to see a lot more details in the weeks ahead, and we'll be working closely with CMHC as well as the federal minister to figure out how we can make sure that an appropriate amount of that funding gets to British Columbia, because the truth is that a lot of federal programs are just divided up by population, but the cost of building housing in BC is far more than the rest of the country. It's more than triple than some provinces. So population alone isn't the only mechanism we want them to use to count this money.
Sure, you know, Montreal by population has a larger population than Vancouver, but housing costs are nowhere near what they are here.
Yeah, what I think is going to happen is that the big crisis that we've had in BC, and it's really different here, our crisis is all over the province, whereas in most of the country it's just in some major centers. So I think that crisis here is going to start to, and it already has, hit Toronto in a really big way. And once Toronto and Hamilton start experiencing some of the mass homelessness and the extreme overspending that we are, I think it might even hit them harder because they don't have any rent control on anything built after 1991. So some people there are seeing their rents double and triple. If that crisis that we're experiencing starts to hit there, I think then you'll see in future federal budgets a need for them to step up even more.
All right. Why doesn't the federal government pay attention until it hits Toronto?
Well, you know, in this case, British Columbia elected a huge caucus of Liberal MPs, and I think everybody in British Columbia, the provincial government, municipalities, were very, very vocal that this was our most important commitment that we needed the federal government to live up to. So it's very important that they have, but it also sets the stage. They've set a 10-year funding window here. The provincial investments were extremely large, and they were last year and this year, but there's nothing there for the long term. So as we go into the BC election, that's one of the things that we'll be asking all parties to look to is a long-term plan to tackle the affordable housing crisis. And we'll be creating our own plan to give to those politicians to say this is what needs to be built, where, how much it's going to cost, and who needs to be housed.
All right, well, let's talk about what needs to be built where. Let's break it down into social housing first. How much more social housing do you think British Columbia needs?
Well, the first thing we need is to stabilize people in their current housing. So we have about 70,000 units of social housing. The biggest risk is that those deteriorate and you need to build new units. If we can save some of that housing and as well as preserve people in their current rental housing, I think that prevents us having to build new. That said, we're probably going to be needing to build upwards of 4,000 or 5,000 units of social housing every single year in BC for the next 10 years because we don't just have a problem of growth, which requires some housing for immigrants, for students, for refugees, other groups. We have the problem of a massive backlog, which has got to be accounted for in some way.
It has to be addressed. 4,000 to 5,000 units a year, though, sounds like an immense amount of building.
Not really. British Columbia is going to welcome 2 million people here over the next 25 years. So what we've done, and we'll be coming out with a plan on April 10th, is project out what percentage of that needs to be for people in deep need, which percent of it needs needs to be rental housing, and we think the market can take care of a whole bunch of the other issues.
Now, in much of the country, being middle class means that you have housing. Housing is not a concern. In British Columbia, especially in Metro Vancouver, being in the middle class means there's no guarantee that you can afford housing.
Yeah, and I think that's why this is so important. And the federal Liberals said that this is a budget for the middle class. What I expect to see from a lot of the housing investments is one where 2/3 of the housing will probably be targeted at middle class, people making $20,000 to $70,000 a year. But then there's 1/3 of it, which will be probably for people in deeper need. The other thing I'd like to see is the federal government, the provincial government be more aggressive in how we target homelessness. So we'll be having the results of the homeless count come out on April 4th for Metro Vancouver. I think some of the data is going to come out from the Fraser Valley, and we're going to see big surges in homelessness. And it's far more expensive to spend on healthcare costs and policing costs and jails, all the sort of rising costs of homelessness, rather than do what's most sensible, most affordable, is build safe, affordable housing with the supports, mental health and addiction that people need.
Kishone Roy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me in.